As the images started to float in
Ame.
on social media of the beautiful dancers at the Nova Festival who had been massacred by Hamas, I remember thinking that surely this would be a turning point in how the left views Israel. The images of these innocent, peace-loving, dancing youths, gorgeous and lithe with their long flowing hair and barely their festival outfits, read to me like some kind of updated ad for the Zionist state in 1947. The scenes from before the festival radiated love and kindness. That 10-second clip of Shani Luke dancing, you watch it and you think, this is what they fought for. And then there's the image of Shani Luke on the back of that truck and the one of her being dragged through the streets of Gaza, thousands cheering and running after her desecrated body. Can you even imagine a starker contrast of good versus evil? It was joy, love, life versus violence, rape, and death. Surely, I thought in my naivete, the left would see themselves reflected in these music loving young people who looked like they had stepped out of the Haight Ashbury in the 70s. Surely Noah Argamani begging for her life as the butchers ride off with her would inspire in the left a sense of identification and a corresponding sense of fear and anger. How could it not? Friends, it did not. Leftist women found nothing in their hearts to say about it for months. There was a total failure of the international feminist community to stand up for the Israeli women who had been brutalized by Hamas in a particularly sexual way. Despite the preponderance of evidence, there was a code of silence from the usual suspects. Some would even deny it. YouTube personalities formed what I like to an "Our Hamas would never" brigade to defend the butchers and the rapists from the evidence of their crimes, insisting it was all war propaganda. Now, this would be bad enough, but you have to remember these women, these publications, these YouTube personalities, you have to remember who they are. These aren't people who, in general, feel that one should have a high standard of evidence before making an accusation of rape. The exact opposite is true. These are the people who demanded that all standards around evidence for accusations of sexual assault be completely suspended. These are the people who demanded that a standard of affirmative consent be deployed to judge whether a woman had consented to sex. And without that affirmation, any sexual encounter was to be deemed rape. These are the people who recoded bad sex as rape, sex one regretted as rape, flirtation as harassment, regrettable kissing as assault. And then they turned around and said, well, does shooting nails into a woman's vagina truly count as rape? Does chopping off a woman's breasts really count as a sexual war crime? Would our Hamas, who after all are very religious people, ever rape anybody? Never mind that Hamas had filmed themselves committing these atrocities, had bragged about them, had GoPro'd them, and sent the images to these women's families. Never mind that they had little booklets with helpfully translated phrases into Hebrew, like, take off your pants. The left was silent, the feminists were AWOL. How could this possibly be? How could it be that just 6 years after the Me Too movement, which gave voice to the outrage women felt at being sexually harassed at work, which upended gender relations and wreaked havoc on workplace after workplace because men had complimented their female coworkers, how could it be that these same women who demanded believe all women could turn around and say, actually, don't believe the confessions of terrorist rapists? The same women who demanded men be fired for asking women out and driven from public life for having consensual sex with underlings were now defending, with their words or with their silence, the mass rape of Israeli women, siding with men who had driven nails into women's vaginas and cut off their breasts to play with them. The same women and organizations who turned flirting at the office into the civil rights issue of our time, when presented with evidence of the mass rape of Jewish women, immediately began to say, we need more context. We need more evidence. Remember the plight of the true victims here, who, it turned out, were the perpetrators. They took their standard of believe all women and turned it on a dime to don't believe the bragging of rapists because their victims were Jews. And this isn't just on the leftist fringe, unfortunately. On CNN, Dana Bash asked Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who I believe is the head of the Progressive Caucus. She said to her, I have seen a lot of progressive women, generally speaking, that are quick to defend women's rights and speak out against using rape as a weapon of war, but downright silent on what we saw on October 7th and what might be happening inside Gaza right now to these hostages. Why is that? She asked Pramila Jayapal, to which Jayapal replied, I think that rape is horrific. Sexual assault is horrific. I think that it happens in war situations. Terrorist organizations like Hamas obviously are using these as tools. However, I think we have to be balanced about bringing in the outrages against the Palestinians. 15,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes, 3/4 of whom are women and children, she said, because our Hamas would never lie about such a thing. Meanwhile, the New York Times, which had an extensive article outlining the mass rapes, then shelved an episode of its popular podcast, The Daily, about the rapes due to internal pressure from its leftist newsroom, which apparently is chock full of members of the Our Hamas Would Never Brigade. The New York Times refused to stand by its own reporting when its sociopathic woke employees demanded that their audience be protected from knowing about this. How is this happening? It's easy to say this is just anti-Semitism. And I want to be clear. Of course, it's deeply fucking anti-Semitic. There's also the political calculation of trying to satisfy multiple constituencies. And the fact that, and I think this is very important, the women's movement has been severely weakened by the transgender agenda, which has gotten women used to being asked to defend transgender rapists, for example, in prisons, or transgender athletes beating up women in sports. I think that being forced to defend this has had a huge impact on the women's movement. But it goes beyond that to the core of leftist ideology, which is built on a belief system that has erased the difference between right and wrong. Now, this belief system is one you will know well if you have been to a university in the last 40 years, or an American newsroom, or on TikTok, or in a meeting with any cultural institution in America, or any progressive organization, including any liberal Jewish organization, or if you're on the board of a museum, or even in a writer's room in Hollywood. People call it critical race theory or Marxism or social justice. I call it wokeness. Wokeness is when you take a worldview that was once based on the difference between right versus wrong, virtue versus evil, and you replace it with a worldview that does not distinguish between right versus wrong, but instead suggests that the world is built on the primary binary of powerful versus powerless. They ascribe inherent virtue to those they see as powerless and evil to those they see as powerful, and they superimpose some characteristic onto the binary, whether it's race or gender or sexuality or national origin or religion, rendering all people, for example, who they see as people of color, powerless and oppressed and thus virtuous, and all white people powerful oppressors who are inherently evil and compromised. This woke worldview absolutely dominates the left, which means it dominates the cultural and intellectual output of the United States these days. Once our elites were eager to offend the powers that be with their art and their scholarship or their journalism, now they will conform at all costs. And the thing they conform to is the view that people of color are inherently virtuous no matter what they do, because they have no agency and are oppressed and marginalized, while white people are inherently evil, the root of everything bad, and responsible for any ills that befall us. This is the source of 21st century leftist anti-Semitism. Every Jew is coded as white, and thus they are the oppressors, and thus they are bad. And every Palestinian is coded as a person of color, and thus oppressed, and thus inherently virtuous. And that includes Hamas. Every Palestinian outranks every Jew on the oppression scale, and thus any Palestinian in conflict with any Jew is the one the left must side with. The Jew has all the agency and is the oppressor, and the Palestinian has no agency and is the oppressed. Anything bad that happens between them must ergo be the Jew's fault, because you cannot blame someone with no agency for anything. They are an innocent, like a child. To the woke, the less powerful has no responsibility to act ethically because their rank on the oppression scale means they cannot act at all. And thus they are inherently imbued with virtue no matter what they do. Their abjection is their virtue. And that goes for the terrorists among them as well. Because to the woke, people of color have no agency when a so-called person of color commits a heinous act against a so-called white person. The agency of their actions must be reassigned to their victims who have agency. What this means is that when a Palestinian rapes a Jewish woman, the agency was hers. It was not his. She remains the oppressor. His act was her fault, and her suffering does not release her from the burden of her status as oppressor, even in death. That is why leftist feminists cannot side with raped Israeli women. To do so is to betray everything they believe. They truly see the Israeli women as deserving of everything that happened to them and having brought it on themselves. Like the conservatives of yore who blamed rape on the miniskirt worn by the victim, the left today blames the fact that Israel has more power than Hamas for everything Hamas does. They simply cannot think their way out of seeing Hamas as virtuous, because to do so would be to admit that their entire worldview is not only wrong, but is fucking disgusting.